Welcome. Today we are going to be looking at biomes. We're going to see how they are set up, how they're categorized, and that is our only learning target for today. So very simply, by the end of today, you should be able to distinguish between the different categories that are biomes. So here we go. Moving on, biomes. First, before we start to look at the biome, we need to understand how it's separated. And one of the first things that's separated by is the abiotic factor of energy. Where does that energy come from? The sun. So remember, all of the energy on this planet comes from the sun. And since all of the energy on this planet comes from the sun, we need to then look at how that energy gets to this Earth. So first, the energy comes in rays, and specifically the rays that would be along the equator are actually a very direct angle, and so it's very strong. Those rays of sun contain the most strength. This is where the majority of energy from the sun would come from, and it's very consistent because that area is always at a very consistent angle toward the sun, so it doesn't change over time. Unlike the north and the south, which because of the Earth's axis and the tilt that it has, they are either going to be faced toward the sun or they're going to face away from the sun. So the north and the south hemispheres are going to have different seasons based upon the way that they are facing, whether they are facing toward the sun or away from the sun. And so the light that's heading to the north and the light that's heading toward the south happens to be at a lower angle, and that provides less energy. So that low angle actually is going to impact the amount of energy that is present in those different areas on the biosphere. So that's going to be important for us. We need to understand how energy gets to the Earth. The majority of it from the sun is going to hit the equator. Less or so will be from the low angles, which are going to provide less energy for photosynthesis, which is going to be very important for plant life, which then is going to be important for every other organism because they will depend on the plant life for food. The plants convert that solar energy to chemical energy, which all other organisms are going to require. So typically, because of that, we actually sort all of the biomes by the different plants that are most abundant. We segment it into these 8 different groupings. It's either a polar biome, a tundra, a taiga, a temperate deciduous forest, temperate grassland, savanna, tropical forest, or a desert. And for the next 8 slides, we're going to go over the basic characteristics of each of these biomes, starting with the polar biome. In the polar biome, you'll notice temperatures are extremely cold year-round. It's located at both the north and the south of the biosphere. So the extreme north and the extreme south of our biosphere, basically the Arctic and the Antarctic, are going to be where we have these different biomes. And you'll notice there's not a lot of plants there. In fact, plant life is pretty much devoid. Typically, they don't get much precipitation, and there isn't much soil. Next, moving just a little bit closer to the equator, we get to the tundra. Now, this happens to get a little bit more direct sunlight than the polar regions, and thus it has a little bit more solar energy. And that means that we're going to end up with the ability for plants to grow because they can undergo photosynthesis. The other thing is there is soil. The issue for the tundra is that the soil isn't deep. You happen to have this thing called permafrost. So the soil that's permanently frozen. And this means that you don't have plants that have very deep roots. That means you're not going to find a lot of trees because trees would be unable to penetrate through the permafrost with their roots. You'll also notice that they don't get much precipitation year-round, only 15 to about 25 centimeters of precipitation per year. And that also would limit the size of the plants that would be able to grow here because they need more water. So, since there isn't a lot of water, you end up not having large plants. So tundras are just slightly closer to the equator from the polar regions. Next, we get to the taiga. This is also referred to as a coniferous forest. This is the largest of all of the terrestrial biomes, which means it's the largest of all the land-based biomes. There are both land-based biomes and marine biomes, and in this, we're just talking about the terrestrial biomes. We're just talking about the biomes on land. It has about 20 to 75 centimeters of precipitation per year, so it gets a lot more precipitation than what you get in the tundra. And you don't have the layer of soil called permafrost, which means you can have trees. This is the first layer that you will find of tree life being abundant. And specifically, it's going to be conifers. So typically your pine trees, your spruces, those are the plants that are going to be succeeding the best. The soil isn't the best, and it's typically pretty acidic because the pine needles that these different conifers are dropping are going to, when they decompose, release acid. So you're going to, because of that pine bed, you're going to have acidic soil, and it's typically sort of nutrient poor, partially because of the acids that are in it. So that is the taiga. From the taiga, moving in a little bit more, we end up with the temperate deciduous forest. Temperate deciduous forest is categorized by the broadleaf trees that it contains, which drop their leaves as you enter into the colder and darker months, and then grow new leaves as they enter into the warmer and sunnier months. So that is a deciduous tree. They are broadleafed. These are typically harder woods. They don't bend as well as the conifers do, which is one reason why they have to drop their leaves, because if they kept their leaves when it snowed, then the snow could weigh down their limbs and snap those limbs off, thus damaging the tree, which would be very bad for it, obviously. So that's why they have to lose their leaves. Plus, there isn't a lot of sunlight anyway, so there's not a big loss in the photosynthesis that they would be doing. So they basically go dormant during the colder and darker months. That means that you're going to have a distinct warm and cold season. You're going to run into what's referred to as the growing season and then the dormant season. So these plants don't grow year-round. They have a seasonality throughout the year for when they're going to grow and when they are going to just go dormant. Precipitation, though, is much higher. You'll notice now we have gotten to about 75 to 150 centimeters of rainfall each year. That's a lot more than what you had in the coniferous forest. That's a lot more than what you had in the taiga and in the tundra, and much, much more than what you had in the polar regions. The soil is typically nutrient rich. The reason it's typically nutrient rich is because all that leaf litter that those plants are dropping is going to decompose and go back into the soil. And so a lot of the nutrients that the trees took from the soil are returned to the soil every single season. Moving to the next, we end up with the temperate grassland. Now, in a temperate grassland, it typically is going to be in about the same area of where temperate deciduous forests are, but there's a few differences for what happens. First off, instead of being trees that's a dominant species, it is grasses. The precipitation is a little bit less, 25 to 75 centimeters a year, and the soil is probably going to be a little less fertile than what you would have in a temperate deciduous forest. So you have less rainfall and you have less nutrients in the soil. That results in less trees. Also, besides just the fact that the nutrients aren't as rich and because you have less rainfall, they typically also deal with disturbances. We're talking about wildfires. We're talking about large grazing animals. We're talking about different things that would disturb the growth of a woody species, because a wood species takes a lot longer to grow than it does other non-woody plants like grasses or ferns. So, woody species typically don't do well in grasslands because of those disturbances. They are not able to succeed. They died off too quickly. Next, we move to the savanna. The savanna, this happens to get a lot more sunlight. We have moved now into the tropical regions of the biosphere. This means that we have moved all the way down to near the equator, which means there's a lot of direct sunlight. That means that there's a lot of energy for photosynthesis to take place. Precipitation is only about 30 to 50 centimeters a year. And in these areas, you have an extreme seasonal variety, which is the wet season and the dry season. So they have a growing season and they have a dormancy season separated by whether or not rainfall or precipitation will occur. Basically, this rainfall only occurs during half of the year. The other half of the year is pretty much dry. So that's going to be very typical for a savanna. The grasslands, though, they every once in a while are going to have some scattered trees and some scattered shrubs. But for the most part, they are dominated again by grasses. Moving to one of the most famous of all of the biomes, the tropical forests. Most people know about the tropical rainforests. Not all forests that are tropical are rainforests. So we'll look at that a little bit later on. The key is that these exist on and very near to the equator. Again, that means that there's a lot of direct sunlight, and with a lot of direct sunlight, that means that there's a lot of energy for photosynthesis, which means that our plant life can really grow well. There's also very little seasonal variation within this biome. So you end up with sunlight very constant, 11 to 12 hours a day, all year. It doesn't matter when in the year that you're looking. Basically, these plants are going to get the same amount of sunlight every single day, all throughout 365 days of the year. The precipitation, though, can vary greatly depending upon where in this biome you are. If you are at a tropical rainforest, well, then you're going to have a lot of rain, much closer to the 250 centimeters a year. One of the reasons for this is because of all of the plant life that you happen to have, all of the transpiration that takes place through the plant's leaves, that actually is going to build clouds up, which will quickly rain back down upon those plants. And so that's the reasons why you would have so much rainfall in a tropical rainforest, is because of all the water that is actually being released from the plant's leaves themselves. They self-generate their rain, which is pretty cool. If you're not in a tropical rainforest, you'd be much closer to the 100 centimeters a year, which is still plenty for a tree to grow, and the soil is fertile enough for trees to succeed. Moving on, we get to the desert. Another very, very, very famous biome. This one, again, lacks in vegetation. The soil typically is not the best soil for a plant to grow in because it's very sandy due to erosion from wind and rain. So the plants are going to have a lot of specializations. The other reason that the plants would have to be highly specialized is because, as you should probably well aware, precipitation is extremely, extremely low, less than 25 centimeters a year. So you're not going to find extremely large trees in this area. You're not going to find a very large plant that also releases a lot of water from its leaves. That would be very, very, very bad for a plant. So these plants are very specialized to hold onto their water, to retain their water as well as they possibly can. And there is an extremely large temperature range in a desert because the humidity is so low. Remember, water has a very, very, very high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy to heat water up, and and water retains that energy. It holds on to that energy. And so if you have an area with extremely low humidity, you don't have that stabilizing force with water in the air. And so the temperature can fluctuate drastically. Moving on, we take ourselves to the summary. This is it, guys. This is the end. The biosphere, you should all recognize at this stage, is divided into different ecological territories, which we happen to call biomes. And for us, you need to know those 8 terrestrial biomes. The terrestrial biomes, they are categorized typically by climate, the amount of precipitation that they have, and the plant life that exists there, which is going to be obviously based upon the amount of sunlight that those areas get, and also the nutrients in the soil. But that overall is how we categorize our biomes. So that's it for this time. Be awesome, stay awesome.